Hey everybody, this is Perch. Well, it's time to talk a little bit about Neil Gaiman. And for what it's worth, to set your expectations in this video, I'm not going to go through the variety of allegations and things he's may or may not have done. Probably, I, the funny thing is, I remember back in the '90s when Neil Gaiman kind of came onto the scene, and he was infatuated with Tori Amos, and they had a friendship and everything else. And I liked Tori Amos at the time. If you were into kind of indie rock alt, music. Tori Amos was, not the top of the list, but you knew Tori Amos and all the rest. And so Neil Gaiman being kind of in that vicinity, in that orbit, and designing characters after, and kind of everything else, it was weird when you heard them talk about. When you heard Neil talk about it, it was creepy and strange. He just came off odd, and a lot of his comments came off like a wannabe rock star. And when you talk to other people in comics, other retailers, others, um, that was the vibe. That like everybody was like, "Yeah, guys, clearly dodgy." Just all kinds of red flags. This is the commentary in the '90s, and then he got more popular, and he became kind of a media darling, and his books became father of science, and he kind of leaned into an older rock star persona. Still very much kind of a set himself above others was the way he came off. And he became kind of a darling to people. It was weird. Um, but that original, impression of him, my impression of him, seeing him and kind of, the interactions, the brief interactions I had, he was odd and not in a good way. Like again, all kinds of red flags. And then, when the kind of pop culture ish wars around 2015, 2016 kind of kicked off, and then there was this, he became one of those people who's like, I respect women. I remember again at Comic Pro talking to some other retailers and even a couple other publishers. And everybody's like, what? Because if you paid attention to the guy for any length of time, that just was absurd that he was now taking this on. But everybody just kept quiet because he was successful and he was popular, and you don't bite the hand that feeds you, so to speak, which is kind of the whole problem, kind of the point of this video. At any rate, if you want to know the gritty details about the allegations, everything else, there's lots of sites that will do that for you. I would be reading you somebody else's reporting. So I'm not steering away from it. You can go to Deadspin. You can go to the very aptly named Vulture. There are lots of sites are covering it at this point. The sites that are not covering it at this point, per the recording, the time I'm recording this video, I'm sure that will change. Bleeding Cool, CVR, kind of the usual suspects. I think the beat has been oddly quiet. And what's going to happen is they will be very late to the show, and it's impossible not to report on it anymore. And they're going to do the well. We wanted to wait until more of the facts were in. We don't want to jump to conclusions, and it's a very very disturbing, very sad story. They're going to take that tone, which by the way, I think is the right way to do this in a lot of cases, and definitely the tone I think they should take. If only they took that with people they don't like. A Bleeding Cool, um, jumps all over Sean Murphy for doing a crowd-funded book on Indiegogo, which as we all know means you're Hitler. And they certainly had no issues tying Ben Templesmith to Warren Ellis, even though Templesmith was the artist on a book, one book of many books that Ellis was doing. And but that didn't stop Bleeding Cool from like, oh, I wonder if he's also got something. I mean, it doesn't stop any of these guys from Rich has no issues walking somebody up to the bus to shove them in front of it, but suddenly, remarkably, when it's one of his friends, it's like we should show restraint. Yeah, okay, sure. At any rate, I mean, the big question with Neil, and I guess one more kind of disclaimer, and this is the kind of comment that I'm about to make that often leads to the usual internet rage grifters talking about how I'm an industry shill. But I think it's a pretty obvious comment. It goes without saying. The industry, the comic creative industry, is not filled with a bunch of Neil Gaimans. The majority of personality type is not that. There are bad actors. There's more than there should be, for sure. There's also just quiet actors, meaning people who just write the book and don't say anything. That's why you notice in a lot of the, they're woke and shitty kind of videos, they're always talking about the same 12 people every time. And at this point, I always laugh. Somebody sent me a link. It's like, well, Perch, how are you going to respond to this? And the video was about Mags, the writer. And like, what is there to say about Mags? Mags is like, Mags is not doing regular comics. There is no news about Mags. The news about Mags is Mags on social media, begging for, medicine to help with the transition. Like that's the news on Mags. So the crazy part of that is, if you really were pissed off about Mags in comics, like you've won. Like that life looks terrible. Like there's nothing good there. But most people, and here's the other last thing I say before we get to Neil. There's a major difference between somebody having a bad day and somebody having a history of being an asshole. And I'll give you this example. If Jim Zub, and Jim Zub obviously been on the channel, I like Jim Zub a great deal. He's a good guy. He's a kind guy. He gives lots of good advice. If Jim Zub decides to one day is having a bad day, flies off the handle on social media, Jim Zub basically says, you're an asshole or you're a jerk, or really kind of rips into a fan. No, you shouldn't do that. But there's a major difference between doing that and repeatedly, continuously doing articles and blogs and posts about how your fans are Nazis and sending pictures of your butthole to people. And those are not the same. And I think too often, those two get conflated. It's like, another guy I think is a really nice guy is Philip Kennedy Johnson. He's very kind. If you meet him at a show, like this is one of the nicest guys you're ever going to meet. He blew his top. Well, and that's even too extreme, but he got irritated over the, I don't know, something to do with Trump and Nazis or whatever else. And he got testy. It wasn't even like, it's testy is the best word. And a bunch of people did write in to me and say, oh, what do you think of your guy now? And it's like, I think he got annoyed because people were peppering him with questions. He's stressed. Who knows? But regardless of all that, there is a major difference between being testy and it being a habitual, continual asshole, a sanctimonious prick, somebody who just routinely causes trouble and is annoying. Those are not the same. And I think it's important that we recognize those are not the same. If you are a, YouTuber who, is desperate to make the next rage dollar, you need all those to be the same because bluntly, it's content for you. But they're not. Anyway, so over to Neil. The big question, and people have been, calling me and asking, like, oh, how does this happen? And that seems to be the big question. How does this all happen? And to me, the answer, I don't think that's a mystery. It happens because, first off, comics as an industry is way too based on kind of this perception of the people who are powerful get a free pass and get ignored. And the people who are powerful let that go to their heads almost immediately and become massive hypocrites. It happens like with such rapid pace, it's ridiculous. There are a lot of really good comic writers or artists, people who have, a decent amount of talent, and they get popular, and the ego goes from 0 to 5,000. And there's a lot of ways to kind of interpret why that is. Maybe it's just a more introverted type hobby, industry. And a lot of people are just not ready for prime time when it comes to public appearances and dealing with people. So that the second they get some glory, they lose their minds. But the bigger culprit in all this is it's accepted. Just like I mentioned earlier, you have these news sites who are just not going to drag their feet in covering this. Neil was part of the club. For a lot of you, because it flipped, and we'll talk about that flip, Warren Ellis was part of the club. It's fascinating to me, and there's kind of a amnesia that's gone on here because Ellis has come to represent the other side, the side of he did nothing wrong. Regardless of whether you think he did something wrong or not, don't forget, Ellis hung out on a message board he controlled with Heidi McDonald, with Matt Fraction, with Kelly Sue, with a lot of people who have just gone out of their way to be judgmental assholes. Just some of them, the quickest to call names, to screech at people. We're chums. Close. I like the word chums because it sounds slightly gross. They were really close. When the problem that I have with somebody like a Heidi, and again, that's another interesting name because I have friends in comics who are like, hey, you really, you shouldn't never say anything bad about Heidi. I don't you that I mean she does a lot of good. Okay, fine, she does a lot of good. She also hung out and called herself like what was the nickname they had, the Dirty Angels or whatever, on the message board, and then 10 years later are talking about harassment of women. But if you were as a mod on his message board, you watched women getting harassed, you watched women being called all kinds of things. You had zero problem with it 10 years earlier. Now 10 years later, suddenly it's like, this behavior is unacceptable. Okay, what changed? And I would respect somebody who came out and did a lengthy, here's how my thinking has changed. I got older and I saw that this stuff wasn't okay. I mean, but admit that your point of view and your perception moved. I don't, it's not okay to basically acknowledge, support. And the problem with Neil is, kind of like I started out, it was not quiet. Lots of people, lots of them. If you are hanging out in the comic industry in the 90s, you absolutely heard the stories about Neil. You heard all this stuff. I was talking to a comic writer, and he's got a little group, and so that the people are chatting around, and he was in comics in the 90s, and we're talking to people like, I can you believe this stuff about Neil? It's like, yes, everyone can. Everyone. It was common. This was the story. And if you're another comic creator, you can definitely be excused to missing it because maybe you just, want to get paid and do your shit and not get involved in all the gossip and the drama and all that other bullshit. Fine. But if you're like a comic journalist, I mean, come on, that's your job. You've heard those stories. And and unfortunately you covered for them, because, he was famous. He was popular. He had money. You wanted access to that person for stories. You wanted to be able to call up and go, Neil, buddy, how are you? Oh, it's so good to see you. Can I do an article with you? I need another 35 cents from Google ad revenue for my site. Can you please? That's why. And in fairness, another reason is because back when the whole Comicsgate thing was going on, Neil, who was a well-known popular name, came out and goes, "These people are sexist pigs. These men are bad. These people are trolls, and they're terrible for treating and talking about women this way." Now the irony there is that based on his behavior, the Comicsgate he was describing, he would have been an ideal member or president of. So. And he knew that when he wrote it. That's why it's all a bit of a game. I think the comic industry tolerates people who get successful. They tolerate people who give them access, and they look the other way. And then one day it changes with Ellis. And to me, I think the smoking gun there was simply, he starts doing more with Netflix. It starts to feel like he's wandering away from comics, like his success and his fame is going to be somewhere else. And it's like, are you taking us with you? You're not? Well, fuck you then. And that's what happened. With Neil, it's a little bit of a different story. Neil, it's just, his stuff, seems again, allegations significantly worse than older pervert Ellis, significantly worse. And yet, again, you would be lying if you had any access to Neil and didn't at least suspect some of this was going on. It was out there for everybody to see. So anyway, we will see. We also live in a world where people are quick to judgment. And so, like I said, these are allegations. They need to be investigated. At this point, though, with kind of the mainstream outlets that are now publishing this stuff and putting it out there, granted, his side of the story should be heard, but it's, the investigation has happened at this point. It's gone fairly far. This isn't, a bunch of psychos on Twitter who are creating gossip about each other. It's just there. The other fascinating part of comics to me is in an industry, and this is a very childish thing I'm about to say, but an industry that's filled with heroes, with people who talk about moral gray areas and the hard choices that people make and all the rest, the difficulties in standing up and being that hero. It is amazing to me how some of the biggest and loudest, and not everyone, thankfully not even the majority, but some of the loudest people are massive hypocrites. Mark Waid, whether you love him or you hate him, he writes a good Superman. He writes good heroes. His run back on Captain America back in the day, not the more recent one, but the back in the day, was great. Guy writes heroes, but definitely his behavior that he puts out is, at best we say hypocritical. At worst we say, well, he may write heroes well, but what he really knows how to do is write villains because he behaves like one. And again, the comic industry will tolerate it because, the publishers didn't for a while, but they're tolerating it now because it's like you sell copies, you have access, and you take shots at quote unquote the right people. I mean, actually, literally, in some cases, no pun intended, the right people. Comics is left leaning. It's amazing to me. Somebody again sent me another article. It wasn't on bounding into comics. It was on one of those, and the person who was writing the blog was like, it was a shock to me when I learned that comic books were filled with more left leaning people. Like, how is that a shock to you? A creative industry filled with liberals. Amazing. This is breaking news. But if you write heroes, if you write these, the Sandman filled with a number of kind of complexity and beauty at times, and yet, and yet, the person behind them absolutely had a lot more in common with the monsters and the heroes. But crazy how that works. As a prediction, kind of final prediction, the Sandman series on Netflix is like at best, they're taking his name off that one and continuing. At worst, that thing's getting shelved. Like I don't know that it did amazing numbers back in the day, but that's over. So anyway, why does comics continue to why does this continue to happen? Well, because the industry largely backs it. That's why. And for what it's worth, it's not like comics is the only place where this happens. Hollywood has the same. If you're popular and you have access and all the rest, then you get a pass. Yeah, I mean, in fairness, no matter where you go, there's people on a variety of parts of the industry, and if they have success, that success excuses a lot of shit behavior. Not me. I do a video and I say retarded at one point during the video, and I got people messaging me. Like, that's really unacceptable. You say things like that. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. What a world. Thanks for listening.